Okay, our next speaker is Jason Hall. Jason is a senior scientist with Kramer Fish Sciences and has over 20 years of experience in fisheries research and restoration effectiveness and status and trends monitoring. He has worked on numerous projects focused on salmonid ecology and habitat use, life history diversity, life cycle modeling, biotelemetry, and habitat restoration from headwater streams to nearshore environments. His talk is titled Deep Planting with Poles in Ecosystems with High Water Stress.
Well, first off, thank you for the invite. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to dust off this project. I'm fond of this project from years past, and excited to share some of the findings from this with you guys. First, I want to acknowledge that this was a project that I developed when I worked with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center and the Watershed program. It was funded by a variety of agencies and included some collaborations between NOAA, BPA, as well as the Park Service, and had many contributors to the project, from planting and monitoring, as well as partners in experimental design and data analysis. So I just wanted to acknowledge the contributions from a lot of folks on this project. So just to start off, I want to give a little bit of background and what our objective was in this study. So as many of you are aware, in dryland ecosystems, we have some significant stressors and challenges to establishing riparian vegetation, including water stress, channel incision, and herbivore or browser pressures. This picture is an image from Bridge Creek, just showing some of the typical dryland ecosystem with channel incision. Supplemental irrigation is expensive and not always practical in all applications. Another challenging aspect to planting in dryland ecosystems, and channel incision specifically, as shown in this picture here, creates lowered water tables that can limit planting opportunities using traditional methods to inset floodplains. And this actually creates another issue in that the inset floodplains can concentrate and channelize flow, which can further impact the resilience or increase the vulnerability of plantings inside the inset floodplains. So as part of a larger restoration and monitoring effort that was occurring in the John Day, we sought to develop and evaluate a strategy that could be used to establish riparian vegetation in a dryland ecosystem with incised channels, lowered water tables, and no supplemental irrigation. Our research questions with this study were specifically to determine and evaluate deep planting as a method to establish riparian vegetation on these high terraces up to 2.5 meters above the streambed elevation in these dryland environments, with lowered water tables associated with channel incision and without the use of supplemental irrigation. And also to test whether or not protection methods could be used to both reduce browser damage and increase survival. The image on the right shows some of the picturesque environment around Bridge Creek where we were working, specifically the Painted Hills John Day Fossil Beds National Monument. You can see it's very dry environment there. And then the two images on the side here are showing the deep planting method in the elevated terraces above the stream bed that lack typical riparian vegetation dominated by sagebrush, etc. And then the Bridge Creek, just an example of incision again there. But I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. So when I'm talking about deep planting, I'm talking about using augers or other tools to plant live poles deeper than you would with traditional methods, but providing them with, or at least the goal is to provide them access to either the lowered water table or soils deeper down that have a higher soil moisture. So these, both the deep planting aspect and the protection aspect were key research questions that we sought to answer with our experimental plantings to help develop a riparian planting plan that was more effective than what had been being used in the area, which was planting short live poles along the narrow band of the stream that typically got blown out with seasonal high flows. So we focused on a 4.5 kilometer stretch of Bridge Creek and the Painted Hills National Monument. This section is heavily incised, has little riparian vegetation. It's mostly dominated by narrowleaf willow. This aerial image shows kind of the span of our 36 experimental plots, which were spread out on terraces that were up to 2.5 meters above the stream bed elevation, so pretty high above the stream bed for Bridge Creek. We had 3 phases of plantings, and this is actually an example of where our monitoring results were used to inform our experimental design and our planting strategy. So our first phase occurred in 2008. I mentioned this was from a while ago, but we used the deep planting method and tested with and without water table penetration, and then tested 2 shelter treatments with assignments at the plot level. And then in phase 2, we had 2 years of planting where we only planted in holes that penetrated water table during drilling, and then tested additional shelter treatments with some random assignments. And then in phase 3 was our sort of implementation phase of what we determined was the best planting strategy, where we just tried to get a baseline for or an example of how that would go in implementation. So in the following slides, I'll give a little more detail on some of the treatments. So with deep planting, again, we used backhoe in this case mostly. We also used a 1 meter handheld motorized auger for some of the lower elevation terraces. But generally, that was our strategy for penetrating the water tables on terraces up to 2.5 meters above the stream bed. We used dormant pole cuttings of black cottonwood, willow, mix of willow species, and some red osier dogwood. And we actually did test some bare root alder stuff, but very limited and don't present any results on that. But our planting generally occurred in the spring. We soaked poles in the creek for at least 24 hours, did some trimming. What I want to really note here is that we used poles 0.5 meters up to 2.3 meters. Average is 1.2 meters. So these are pretty big live poles. And in the phases that I mentioned in the previous slide, we planted over 1,000 poles with each of these efforts. So it was pretty intensive. And we also included the browser protection treatments, as I mentioned. But this was not only designed to look at ways to protect the plants from browser damage. As mentioned in the previous talk, and we have things like beaver, also cattle, not particularly in this area because of the national monument status, but there's other browsers, elk and whatnot, pronghorn, that significantly zero in on these plantings, especially in places where there's not a lot of riparian vegetation. And so we sought to test that aspect of it, but also in a dryland environment, we're dealing with evapotranspiration and water stress in general, and some of these shelters are designed to reduce that. And so we, in our first phase, included unprotected plantings, 3-foot plastic tree shelters that are designed to protect from browser damage as well as provide water stress protection by reducing evapotranspiration losses, and then 6-foot circular fence cages, primarily designed to protect from browsers. And then we, in the second phase, adapted our 3-foot plastic tree shelter with a 5-foot mesh shelter on top, and then also tested a taller plastic tree shelter, 6-foot plastic tree shelter. In the last phase, we transitioned to just using 6-foot plastic tree shelters, which you'll understand why we did that in the next few slides. So These slides cover the results of our experimental plantings. So in the first phase, we had some pretty clear results. The plots on the left shows proportion of survival by the water table penetration treatment as well as the shelter. And you can see with the red star there highlighting, we had significantly higher survival for plants that were, or poles that were planted with deep planting and access to the water table and protected by a 3-foot plastic tree shelter. It was pretty clear. But when you look at the plot on the right, you see that the percent or proportion of plants that were browsed was actually still pretty high with the 3-foot plastic tree shelters. In the circular cages there in the middle, the CC treatment had the lowest rates of browse damage in the first 3 years of monitoring. And so while deep planting appeared to provide access to the water table and protecting those with 3-foot plastic tree shelters significantly increased survival, we still had pretty high browser damage for our 3-foot plastic tree shelters. So in the phase 2 of the project, we explored some ways to take advantage of that survival benefit from the plastic tree shelters combined with the deep planting method and increase our herbivore protection. Should note also that the circular cages, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, are a pain in the butt to install. They're heavy in the backcountry. Takes a lot of effort to get all that material out there compared to a light plastic tree shelter, and they're typically more expensive to deploy. So this has a number of potential benefits for this kind of application, at least. But so we explored this 5-foot mesh shelter on top of the plastic tree shelter in an attempt to increase the protection from browser damage, but also the 6-foot plastic tree shelter, see if that would ultimately help us address the issue. So these plots on the left here show the results of our survival. On the top, you can see pretty comparable survival among the treatments. And then the plot on the bottom, you can see that both the 3-foot plastic tree shelter with the mesh shelter and the 6-foot plastic tree shelter significantly reduced browser damage. But as I show in this picture here, we actually had quite a hard time keeping the plastic or the mesh shelters attached to the poles with the high wind environment, or it could have even been the browsers themselves dislodging them. We had a lot of broken stakes and found a lot of plants like this where the mesh shelter had collapsed and results in some damage to the plants. So ultimately, we decided that the best combination was a 6-foot plastic tree shelter with deep planting, providing the plants with access to the lowered water tables and protecting them with the 6-foot plastic tree shelter, providing both the survival benefits and the browser protection benefits. So in the third phase, we ramped this up in full scale, did a mix of willow and cottonwood, went throughout these experimental planting area and planted over 1,000 poles this way, and then came back a year after just to sort of do a benchmark check. And we found that our plants had 67 to 73% survival. Terminal bud damage was minimal at 2 to 4% of the plants, and heights ranged right around a meter. And we also noted that survival was significantly higher for willow compared to cottonwood, but overall survival rates were pretty darn good considering where we were planting and the conditions we were planting and without water. And so I just want to note that at least this part of the study, all this information that I presented so far are described in more detail in a couple of publications that we did put together. The citations are there for your reference if you're interested in getting more information on that. But I also wanted to share with you, since moving to Kramer Fish Sciences from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, I had the opportunity of helping with a action effectiveness monitoring study that was being run by Kramer a couple of years ago. And the monitoring officially ended for that project in 2012, but we went out and did some additional monitoring in 2018 as part of an extensive post-treatment analysis that looked at 41 planting sites 2 to 24 years post-treatment. So the Bridge Creek study that I designed when I was with NOAA was right at about 7 years post-treatment. And among all these sites, the EPT study that we were doing that included the Bridge Creek site included many different planting methods that were used, but the Bridge Creek sites were the only ones that included deep planting, and also provided an opportunity to present some updated results with respect to survival and how things have been going, because I think we're all kind of generally interested in the long-term results of planting strategies. And while the couple of years post planting can provide some information, we all know that riparian planting and just planting in general is a long game. You might not see benefits, the kind of benefits that you're designing the projects to provide for decades after you do the planting. So this is really where the fun is. And so this image here is from those surveys. I got to go out and survey the site with our crew. This is in 2018. And these were on a terrace that was about 1.9 meters above the stream bed. And you can see, for size reference there, our field crew, these cottonwoods are doing quite well. These particular ones were protected with a 6-foot circular cage, still there, as you can see. But the plots on the right show the results of that EPT monitoring effort, and the design of that study was comparing treatment reach, in this case a reach that had been planted with riparian plants, to a reach that had not, or control. And so the results of that study found that in this site, there's a higher abundance of woody riparian plants compared to the control reaches. The top plot shows abundance by different species. And then the bottom plot shows higher species diversity richness compared to control reaches. So I thought this was very fun to go out and see all this grown up riparian plots from the study, and that was pretty cool. Also noted some other anecdotal observations. The picture on the left shows some observations of natural recruitment and expansion occurring in the understories. So there's some local shading and microclimate stuff potentially going on there, which is indicative of some improving or attaining riparian functions. And then on the right, you can kind of see how we're starting to see some shade forming at the floodplain terrace level, and also some potential for contribution to bank stabilization. You can see a small incised channel bank here, which presumably those plants on the terrace would potentially help stabilize as the channel moves around. And then lastly, for a little bit of fun here, I put together a slideshow of a time series from Google Earth. We did not have our LiDAR or drone imagery for this site at the time. That was just not something we were collecting at that point in time, but we do have some cool images from Google Earth that I just want to step through. This is 2005 pre-planting, looking at a section inside the planting area, and you can see there actually are some pretty vegetated areas inside the inset floodplain, again, mostly dominated by the narrow leaf willow, but you can see the elevated terraces are pretty much devoid of riparian vegetation, mostly grasses and scrub steppes. So this is the last year of planting in 2011, and also a horrible aerial image, but you can see generally the same lack of vegetation in the floodplain terraces. And here you can actually, 2 years post-planting in 2013, you can actually see some of our experimental plots in a grid. That pattern kind of pops out a little bit easier for the eye, but there's also some other planting plots that you'll see more visible in the later imagery. So 3 years post-planting, 2014, you can start to see more of those trees growing up, as well as some shading. And again, 2017, you can see those developing even more. And then lastly, in 2020, those really pop out, especially with the shading there, but you can see those coming up. And so I thought this was really cool. All of this was done again without supplemental irrigation. This is just drilling into the floodplain terrace at that elevated elevation above the stream bed and providing access to the lowered water table. Cottonwood and willow are particularly adapted following water tables as they draw. So the premise we were hoping for is that if we can at least just give them access to the water table, they can follow it, put their roots out wherever they need to. But there wasn't a lot of information in the literature at the time to really suggest whether or not this was a effective method given the height above the stream bed that we were trying to plant and establish riparian vegetation. And also a sidebar to the study was there's a lot of beaver restoration going on in this area too. And so being able to provide riparian vegetation in these terraces as well as the inset floodplains can help support beaver, which then presumably would help with the channel incision process through their dams and sedimentation processes and all their engineering stuff that they do. So just to wrap things up, we asked the question, can deep planting be used to establish riparian vegetation on high terraces with lower water tables and without irrigation? Our results pretty strongly supported yes to that, but we found that it was best when combined with a plastic tree shelter, presumably to help with the evapotranspiration. It worked on terraces up to 2.5 meters above the stream bed. We didn't try much higher than that, but it's possible it could work where you start to get soil moisture through capillary action. It can actually raise the water table elevation relative to the stream bed. And it worked for live poles up to 2.3 meters long. The herbivore protection methods, again, we found that the circular cages provided the best protection as well as the 6-foot plastic tree shelters. But the 6-foot plastic tree shelters are cheaper, easier to install, and increase survival. And I'll tell you, it was much funner to carry a case of a rack of 6-foot plastic tree shelters 3 miles in a national monument compared to dragging rolls of circular fence cage out there. And so I guess just to close, I know we're talking with the Skagit context here or the wet side context here, but one question I just want to propose is whether or not this method has applications in non-dryland environments. When we have terraces, high terraces associated with floodplains in many of the systems over here, and they may similarly be affected by water stresses in the summer. And so it's possible that the deep planting methodology would be applicable in this side as well, or in the wetter environments. And so I just want to put that out there. And with that, I'll close and ask if there's any questions.
We have some questions in the Q&A. The first one is, what was the width of your auger specs for your stakes, and where did you source your stakes?
Good questions. Okay, so last one first. We got the stakes from Clarno. It was a local nursery in the area, so they were all local nursery stock propagated from. They were cropped from their stock, and so we tried to plant stuff from the area. And then see the other question. I think it was a 6-inch wide auger on the backhoe mounted auger, and the hand powered or the motorized hand operated auger, I believe, was a 2-inch auger. And what was the third question? Sorry.
Where did you get the stakes? Did you answer that one already?
Yeah, Clarno, the Clarno nursery.
Clarno. And then yeah, Brenda asked the same question. What was the range of diameters of your poles?
The poles or the auger? I thought it was the auger question.
I think both are asked.
Okay. So I answered the auger question. I'd have to go back and look at the papers. We summarized the diameters of the live poles, but I believe they were mostly under 2 inches in diameter. it's hard to plant that long of a live pole without getting some thickness to those.
Laura asks if you experimented with clusters of dense planting of large poles. And she says, I've often found the critters will harm the outside edge plants, but can't as easily access the center of the plots.
Oh, interesting.
To see an experiment like that.
Yeah, no, we didn't look at that. We did actually take GPS points on every plant with RTK, and I had a note on a previous slide that each plant was individually ID'd with a tag. So it's possible the answer to that question might be addressed by looking at some of that data, because when we went back and monitored, we recorded browser damage at the individual plant level, and you could look at the outside of plots versus the interior for one, but no specific elements designed to test that with this, but that would be interesting.
To reduce plastic use, are there any options for tree shelters that provide the same protection but are biodegradable material?
Good question. I think some of the plastic tree shelters are designed to be degradable, but honestly, they don't seem to go away, especially in these dryland environments. That's actually a significant maintenance step. They're perforated, they're designed to rip open when the tree outgrows them, but I think the more proactive strategy is to plan some retrieval and cleanup associated with that. But even with that, we found that some of the pulse flows caused scour, and we lost plants to flow, as well as beaver found some of the materials quite useful for their dam building, and they just stole the whole thing. And so we inadvertently ended up with plastic tree shelters and supplies in the river and whatnot. So no, those are things definitely to consider.
Did you see a difference in survivorship between the wire fences, plastic tree shelters?
In survival, yes. The survival was significantly higher with a plastic tree shelter than the wire fences. And again, we hypothesized that was because of the additional benefits for reduced evapotranspiration that those shelters provide compared to the fence cages.
And how much evapotranspiration would be expected from the willow and cottonwood trees at more than 20 feet height? And is there any influence on the free water in Bridge Creek from the plantings?
Yes, that's a good question. We actually did have groundwater monitoring wells in these plots. I suspect that they're no longer monitored. I think I was the one doing that, and those are probably not active anymore, but that would be something you'd probably have to address with an additional study, but it's something you could do with a similar plan if you continued groundwater monitoring, or maybe took spot samples at various points with monitoring wells.
Here are two questions. Did crews conduct any vegetation management around the plantings, and were there any impacts from small rodents?
No vegetation management in the area that I'm aware of, not during the first 3 phases especially. I don't know about since. And as far as rodent damage, yes, we did notice some rodent damage, and it was noted in our monitoring database, but it was not very prevalent, so we didn't report on anything there.
And how do you recommend the cheapest, best way to determine water table and depth for deep planting? Pilot holes prior to planting and wait.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, our first phase was kind of more experimental, including this deep planting methodology. So we specifically planted in holes that did not penetrate the water table, and as well as those that did. And we simply determined that from the tailings. When we pull up the auger, or we had it's a water quality monitoring tool. It's a basically a tape that has like a measuring tape that has demarcations on it for distance or length, and it's weighted at the end, but it has a sensor at the bottom of it. And so when it touches water or moisture, it buzzes. And so we could use that, but generally you can tell from the tailings whether or not you hit wet soil or water, and then we could do that. And so when we moved into the other phases of the project, we transitioned to just doing that, putting in pilot holes in some terraces, you might imagine, because of geomorphology and soils and other things. We found some old oxbows that retained some subsurface flows that appeared, and we were able to plant in areas. And so we kind of did that with our later phases, where we were able to drill pilot holes and find where we were able to penetrate the water table on these terraces. Elevation wasn't always the key factor, like I said there, but that's a pretty effective strategy, and it's pretty easy to determine, at least in the soils out there, when you hit water. If you had soils that are more prone to collapsing and don't retain after an auger, it might be harder to both plant and determine if you are in wetted soils.
What happens with plastic protectors as the tree grows?
Oh, so I mentioned that they are perforated, so they're designed to rip. That doesn't always happen well. And so, like I said, I think it's best to have a proactive strategy to plan to go out and remove those, but they are designed to presumably rip when they open. We found some during this later monitoring where they were still on and the tree hadn't quite ripped them, and so I'm not sure it's the best practice to let them do their thing. Probably better to go out there and remove them, but you have to plan for that.
And Paul asks, did you consider the water jet stringer method, or do you suspect if it would serve a similar function without the backhoe?
Interesting. I will have to look at that link. Is that a relatively recent article? Like I said, it's been a while since I did this project, but I'm not familiar with that, but I can kind of envision what that is.
It's basically just a pressure, using a pressure washer and a long thing to drill the hole rather than the force of the backhoe.
Yeah, so I mean, the only thing I would foresee being difficult there is you wouldn't be able to determine whether or not you penetrated the water table because you made everything wet. So if you have some idea of what kind of water table elevations you're dealing with or how deep you need to plant them, then that might be worth experimenting with that. I just haven't looked at that, but good idea, good thought.
What did you fill in the rest of the hole with after installing a pole? My crew uses a muddy slurry when planting shorter live stakes.
Good question. We actually just used the tailings from the hole itself. There was some cases where we got into some more clay soils. As you remember the picture I showed you of the Painted Hills National Monument, there's actually quite a bit of clay out there, and there's also a Mazama ash layer that's pretty thick out there. So when we weren't able to reuse the tailings from the hole itself, and we would put those in and then compress it so that we wouldn't end up with like if you just collapse the top of the hole over, you end up with a big air pocket in that hole. So we took care to push the soil down through the auger hole around the light pole. And where we ran out of soil, we simply just used soil from the banks of the incised stream bed. It's readily exposed, so easy to access and fill from soil on site. But we didn't do anything specific to make it wet, or more wet or less wet.
Have you found the NRCS web soil survey or other tools to predict water table depth in project planning? Or how have you found the NRCS wet soil survey or other tools?
Ooh, I have not looked at that. I wouldn't have any insight on that, but I presume that along with some local area monitoring would probably be useful in helping inform. But if you have the tools, it's easy to just drill some pilot holes. But I mean, from a planting plan development perspective, it's best to kind of have as much of an idea of what you're going to be dealing with before you go out there either way, so you have the right supplies to test. But I have not used that tool.
How did you start this project? Get involved with Craig?
So I assume, is that talking about the project when it was started, or the, yeah, so I'll assume that. So I was involved with the Bridge Creek restoration project, and like I mentioned, there was one aspect of it that was focused on beaver restoration. We were actually planting beaver dam analogs in the channel to provide them a structure to work with. The goal was to support restoration of the incised channels, start the processes, bring the channels up, and reconnect them with their disconnected floodplains and terraces. And another aspect of that was riparian planting, but the previous methods were planting tens of thousands of live poles, but just along the stream bed, and those were getting blown out. And they've been doing that for years and years and years, and there was just nothing much to show for it on the in Bridge Creek. And so I came into the project, and one of my goals was to try and figure out a way that we could get riparian vegetation established on these disconnected terraces without requiring a bunch of irrigation, and just sort of prepping the stage for getting this going, and in the long-term objective of reconnecting the creek with the floodplain as it grades, and also providing potential source of input for beaver, as well as largely debris and other shading, other processes to support long-term recovery. So that's how I got involved in that project, was to try and answer this particular research question.
Then somebody put in a comment about the water jet stringer. It would be able to make a pilot hole about 6 feet deep.
Okay.
And then the next question is, do you think planting with longer stakes could be worth it in wet regions, even if the length of the stake is more than enough to reach the water table? In other words, would it be unnecessary in wetter regions?
I don't know. I had some concerns about the longer poles and rot in the soil, but it seems like, based on particularly this image from 7 years later, that things seem to be doing well. The active growth, they're continuing to grow, they're established pretty well. But I suspect I feel like at least that concern would be more in an environment that's wetter in general, and so it would potentially warrant some testing and investigation in our area to ask those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I think it's really encouraging to see the successful establishment in the dryland ecosystems, especially thinking about the pattern we have of longer summer drought on the west side. There's a lot to learn for sure from the restoration work going on in the adjacent ecosystems in other parts of the Northwest.